The marble hall was alive with noise. Footsteps clicked over the polished floor, papers rustled in impatient hands, and the air buzzed with the mingled voices of reporters, aides, and young officers in crisp uniforms. Chandeliers hung overhead like frozen constellations, scattering warm light across gilded arches. It was a place where important words were spoken, where decisions rippled far beyond its walls. And then, a voice cut through it all. The sound was sharp, like a whip crack, echoing in a language most in the room had never heard before. The syllables rolled out with a commanding rhythm, each one heavy with authority. Conversations died in mid-sentence. Soldiers stopped mid-step. Heads turned toward the source. But one person froze for a different reason entirely. Lena. She stood near the far wall, wearing her plain gray cleaning uniform, sleeves rolled past her elbows, hands damp from wringing the mop. She had been pushing the bucket forward, lost in the steady rhythm of work, when the sound struck her like a lightning bolt. The voice carried words she thought she would never hear again, an old battlefield order, unmistakable and urgent. Her fingers tightened around the mop handle until her knuckles turned white. The moment yanked her backward through years she had tried to bury. Somewhere among the crowd, the speaker, a tall man in a dark military coat, stood at a podium, his gaze scanning the hall. When his eyes found hers, the air between them seemed to hum. For a heartbeat, neither moved. He knew her. She knew him. And the years between them dissolved. Not long ago, Lena had worn a uniform too. Not this shapeless gray work shirt, but the fatigues of a combat medic. She had been barely 20 when she was sent into a war that never made the newspapers back home. She still remembered the grit between her teeth, the sting of antiseptic in her nose, the roar of engines above, and the endless calls for medic, slicing through gunfire. And she remembered that order, the one now hanging in the air, spoken in that exact tone. It had been the signal to rally the wounded, to brace for impact, to hold the line no matter the cost. She had believed the man who gave that order was gone forever. She had believed her war was over. She had been wrong. A murmur passed through the crowd. "What language is that?" someone whispered. The man at the podium, General Marlowe, though few here would know his name, did not answer. He simply waited, standing as though the weight of the entire hall rested easily on his shoulders. Lena's body moved before her mind caught up. One slow step, then another. Her heartbeat roared in her ears, matching the rhythm of her boots from years ago. With every stride, images flashed behind her eyes, carrying a soldier with blood pouring down his back, her knees buckling under the weight, the sting of shrapnel against her skin, whispering reassurances in the dark while tying a tourniquet. The crushing silence after the last gunshots faded. By the time she reached the front, she could see the lines around the general's eyes, lines carved by years of command and loss. His gaze softened when he saw her, but his voice remained steady. "Report," he said in the language only they shared. The sound of it made her chest tighten. Without hesitation, she answered. Her voice was firm, though her heart was racing. She gave her name, her old rank, her unit. The words felt strange in her mouth, like a song she had not sung in years, but they still fit. Gasps rippled through the room. People leaned forward, sensing that something rare and private had just surfaced into the open. The marble hall, moments ago just another stage for speeches, now felt like a place where history was unfolding. Not the kind written in books, but the kind carried in scars and memories. Lena kept speaking, her voice quiet but unshakable. She spoke of that night, the chaos, the desperate scramble to save the living, the screams that chased her into her dreams. She spoke of the bitter retreat, of running through fields under fire, of the moment she crossed the last stretch to safety. And she told him, in front of everyone, how she had traded her medic's satchel for a mop, her combat boots for worn sneakers, her battlefield identity for anonymity. For years, she had carried the silence. Now the words were free. Long before Lena ever touched a mop, her hands had been steady over bleeding wounds. The years had not dulled her memory. If anything, they had sharpened the edges. It always began the same way. The sharp sting of dust in the air, the deep vibration of engines, and the low thud of distant artillery. She had been 20 years old when the draft letter came. The words were short, clipped, and final. They didn't ask. They ordered. She reported for training, her small frame swallowed by fatigues that smelled faintly of oil and canvas. While others cursed under their breath at the drills, she absorbed every lesson like a sponge, knowing that every skill might one day decide whether someone lived or died. They called her Doc before she'd even earned the right. Her field kit became an extension of herself: scissors, bandages, vials, and clamps arranged so she could find them in the dark without looking. The first time she stepped into the war zone, the heat struck her like a wall. The air shimmered over cracked earth, and the horizon wavered under a haze of smoke. They were stationed near a border that maps avoided naming, where alliances shifted like sand and each sunrise carried new uncertainty. For months, her life was a cycle of chaos and exhaustion. She moved between makeshift shelters, ducked under the whine of incoming fire, and crawled through trenches to reach the wounded. Blood became a color she could see even with her eyes closed. But the war wasn't just blood and bullets. It was the sound of whispered promises to the dying, of boots scuffing against stone in the dead of night, of letters read aloud under flickering lamps because someone couldn't read them themselves. And then there was him. General Marlowe hadn't been a general back then, just Captain Marlowe, commander of a small unit that refused to fold under pressure. He had a voice that cut through panic, not because it was loud, but because it carried certainty. When he gave orders, people obeyed without thinking, not from fear, but because they trusted him. Lena remembered the first time she heard the command, that command. It had been during an ambush at dusk. Enemy forces had struck harder than anyone expected, scattering their lines and pinning them down. The air had been thick with dust and screams when Marlowe's voice had rung out across the chaos in that foreign tongue. A call to rally, to hold, to save who could be saved. It was the kind of order that didn't need explanation. She had understood it in her bones before her mind caught up. That night was burned into her memory. She had found Corporal Hayes, slumped against a wall, blood pooling under him. She'd patched him where he lay, hands working fast, every second weighed against the distant gunfire. She remembered lifting him onto her back, staggering through a street littered with rubble, the strain in her legs eclipsed by the fear that if she stopped, he would never breathe again. When she finally reached the rally point, she had collapsed in the dirt beside the others, lungs burning, sweat streaking through the grime on her face. Marlowe had passed her a canteen, his eyes meeting hers for the briefest moment. No words, just a silent acknowledgement that she had done what needed to be done. That was the last time she saw him before the end. The war's final days had been a blur of retreat and desperation. Supplies ran thin, communications broke down, and orders became harder to trust. Her unit had been scattered, some captured, some gone without a trace. She'd crossed miles of open ground under cover of night, carrying nothing but her medic kit and the will to survive. By the time she reached friendly territory, her boots were in tatters and her body a map of bruises and scars. She was told the conflict was over, though no one could explain what over meant when so many were gone. Civilian life felt alien. The noise of traffic replaced gunfire, but it didn't stop her from waking in the night, heart pounding, hand reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. People complained about the weather or the price of bread, and she nodded politely, saying nothing about the things she'd seen. She traded her kit for cleaning supplies, her name tag for a blank uniform, her war stories for silence. Years passed like that. She worked in places where no one knew her past. She learned to move quietly, to be useful without being noticed. Her war belonged to another life, one she had locked away. Until today, that single command, spoken in a hall full of strangers, had cracked open a door she thought was sealed. Standing before General Marlowe now, she realized the war had never truly left her. It had been waiting, silent, in the marrow of her bones. The distance between Lena and the general wasn't more than 30 paces, but it felt like crossing a battlefield. The marble floor gleamed under the chandeliers, every polished tile reflecting her slow approach. Around her, the crowd shifted in puzzled silence, their eyes tracking the gray-clad cleaning woman who walked as if in a trance. Each step carried the weight of years she thought she had buried. The hall smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, but in her mind, She could still smell the iron tang of blood, the smoke of burning buildings, the sweat of soldiers pressed shoulder to shoulder in the dirt. The general didn't move. His gaze never wavered from hers. It was the same look she remembered from the war, calm in the storm, commanding without force. Even now, in a place far from the battlefield, that look still held power. She became aware of the sound of her own breathing, steady but heavy, as if she were climbing a hill with a full pack again. Memories flickered in her mind like the stutter of an old film reel. A flash of carrying a man twice her size, his blood soaking through her uniform. The burn in her muscles, the desperate whisper, just a little farther, stay with me. The feel of her knees buckling but refusing to fall. The white flare of an explosion somewhere behind her. The ringing in her ears. She could hear boots pounding on hard ground, but when she blinked, it was the marble floor underfoot. Halfway to the podium, she noticed whispers rising in the crowd. Some people leaned toward each other, trying to guess who she was. Others simply stared, sensing something unspoken unfolding before them. The soldiers lining the walls straightened unconsciously, their instincts catching the shift in atmosphere. When she reached the final few steps, the general's expression softened, though his posture remained solid as stone. "Report," he said. The word, spoken in their shared language, struck her like a key turning in a long-locked door. It wasn't a request. It was the same order she'd answered once before, under gunfire and smoke. Her reply came without hesitation. "Lena, combat medic, 3rd Field Unit." Her voice was firm, steady, though her chest tightened with each syllable. It felt strange to say those words again, to wear them in her mouth after years of silence. Gasps rippled through the hall. People who had seen her as invisible a moment ago now looked at her as though they were seeing her for the first time. The general inclined his head slightly, inviting her to continue. She spoke, not loudly, but with the precision of someone who had recited these memories in her own mind countless times. She told him, and by extension, everyone listening, about that night. The chaos, the sudden attack, the scramble to move the wounded before the enemy closed in. She described the screams that still visited her in dreams, the smell of burning cloth, the weight of men who would never walk again. She spoke of the retreat, not a sprint, but a slow, punishing crawl through ruined streets, carrying those who could not carry themselves. Her words were simple, but in them was the unvarnished truth of survival. She told him how she had slipped away under cover of darkness, crossed miles of open terrain, and finally reached safety with little more than her life and the uniform on her back. How she had traded her medic's satchel for a mop, her boots for sneakers, her war name for silence. Around them, the hall was so quiet that the sound of the chandelier's faint sway could be heard. The people in the room, politicians, reporters, officers, leaned in unconsciously, drawn into a story that belonged to a woman they had overlooked moments earlier. The general's eyes glistened faintly, but his face remained composed. When she finished, there was a heartbeat of silence before he stepped away from the podium. The light caught the medals on his chest as he moved. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the fine lines etched around his eyes, the wear of years in service. His hand, strong and steady, came to rest on her shoulder. "You answered the call when no one else could," he said quietly, in their shared language, "and you have done so again today." The young soldiers flanking the hall seemed to straighten even further at his words, as though the weight of the moment pressed on them too. Then the applause began. At first it was hesitant, polite. Then it grew, swelling into a wave that filled the hall and echoed off the marble. Lena stood frozen for a moment, the sound washing over her. She had been invisible for so long that being seen felt almost unbearable. Part of her wanted to step back, to fade into the background again, but the general's hand remained on her shoulder, holding her there, not as a prisoner, but as a witness to her own worth. The applause rolled through the hall like a tide, swelling and receding in waves, but never fully fading. It was not the polite kind given to a scheduled speech. It was raw, unplanned, and laced with something deeper. Respect. Lena stood rooted to the polished marble floor, the general's hand firm on her shoulder. For years, she had drifted in the quiet shadows of anonymity, her identity stripped down to her first name, and a job that asked no questions. But now, every face in the room was turned toward her, as if a curtain had been pulled back to reveal someone they thought they knew, but never truly saw. The applause grew louder, echoing beneath the high, arched ceiling. Soldiers in crisp dress uniforms clapped with the same intensity as reporters in tailored suits. Even the aides who normally scribbled without pause had set down their pens, their eyes fixed on her. She didn't know where to look. Her instincts told her to lower her head, to make herself smaller, to escape the center of attention. But the general's hand was steady, an anchor keeping her in place. When the applause finally softened, General Marlowe stepped forward, his voice carrying easily without the aid of the microphone. He spoke in the common tongue now, his words for everyone in the hall. "Courage," he began, "does not fade with time. It does not vanish when the uniform is hung up, nor when the weapon is set aside. It lives in the choices we make, in the moments when we act, even when no one is watching." His eyes swept over the crowd, but his hand never left Lena's shoulder. "This woman," he continued, "once stood between death and the wounded, with nothing but her skill, her will, and the belief that every life was worth saving. She did not do this for glory. She did not do it for recognition. She did it because it was right." A hush fell over the hall, the kind of stillness that makes every word heavier. "She has lived quietly since then," Marlowe said, his voice softening. "But make no mistake, bravery does not expire, and kindness does not wither. Even without a uniform, she carries the same heart she did in the darkest of hours." The applause began again, this time with a different rhythm, not hurried, but deliberate. Lena felt it deep in her chest, not as noise, but as a kind of acknowledgement she had never expected to receive. Her throat tightened, and for a moment she feared her voice would betray her if she tried to speak. She glanced toward the soldiers along the walls, young men and women, their faces unlined by time, their eyes wide with the realization that heroes did not always look like the ones in their history books. One young private caught her gaze and gave the slightest nod, as if to say he understood, or at least wanted to. That small gesture warmed her more than the applause. When the clapping subsided once more, Lena finally found her voice. It was quieter than Marlowe's, but steady. "I was just doing my job," she said. A murmur passed through the crowd, but the general gave a small smile. "Perhaps, but there are many who did their jobs that day, and not all of them are here to tell their story. You are." Lena didn't reply. She didn't need to. The truth was plain between them. For a long moment, the hall seemed to hold its breath. The chandeliers swayed gently, scattering shifting patterns of light across the polished floor. Outside, the muffled hum of city life went on, car horns, footsteps, the faint call of a street vendor. But in here, time felt suspended. When the general finally released her shoulder, it was not abrupt. His hand lingered a heartbeat longer, as if sealing something unspoken. Lena stepped back, letting the space between them widen, but the warmth of his acknowledgement remained. She turned, moving slowly toward the side of the hall, where her mop and bucket still waited, as if nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. As she walked, she caught fragments of conversation. "She was a medic. I had no idea. Incredible." Some voices were awed, others skeptical, but all of them carried her name now, spoken with a new weight. When she reached her mop, she wrapped her hands around the handle again. The familiar wood felt different, lighter somehow. She dipped it into the bucket, the water rippling with the faint vibrations of lingering applause. She began to work again, the rhythm steady and unhurried. But the marble hall no longer felt cold or indifferent. Each stroke of the mop felt like a thread binding the past to the present, stitching together the two versions of herself, the medic and the cleaner, into one. She glanced over her shoulder once, almost without thinking. The general was still watching her, his expression unreadable, but his presence unmistakable. Not as a stranger, not as a superior officer, but as a witness to her story. In that moment, Lena understood something she had not before. Recognition wasn't about medals or ceremonies. It was about being seen, truly seen, for what you had done and who you were, even if it was only once, even if it came years later. And now she had been. When the event ended, The hall began to thin. The press packed away their cameras, their voices dropping to hushed speculation as they filed toward the grand double doors. Soldiers broke formation, their polished boots clicking in unison as they marched out. The lingering scent of polished brass and fresh paper hung in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of the coffee that had been served earlier. Lena stayed where she was, her mop balanced loosely in her hands. She moved slowly, tracing the mop's path over the marble floor, not because it needed cleaning, but because it gave her something to do. She could still feel the echo of the applause in her chest, a strange mix of warmth and ache, as though it had stirred something she'd kept locked away for years. A few people stopped on their way out to nod to her, their expression softer now. Some offered quiet words, "Thank you," "Incredible," "Honored to meet you." They didn't know her story in full. They only knew the fragment they had witnessed today. But even that seemed to change the way they looked at her. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. For years, Lena had chosen invisibility. It was easier to be just another face in the background, to let the world assume she had no history worth asking about. But now, the veil had been pulled back, and she wondered if she could return to that quiet anonymity, or if she even wanted to. The general had long since left the podium, but she caught sight of him near the exit, surrounded by aides. He was listening intently to one of them, nodding occasionally, but at some point, he glanced back toward her. Their eyes met across the room, and he gave the smallest of nods before turning away. It was not a farewell. It was an acknowledgement. Lena dipped her mop into the bucket, watching the water swirl and cloud. The image reminded her of the rivers she had crossed during the war, murky and cold, hiding unknown dangers beneath the surface. She thought of the people she had carried across those waters, some clinging to life, others already gone. She had learned something in those years that no civilian life could teach. Courage was not about being fearless. It was about moving forward despite the fear, making the hard choice when the easy one would be to turn away. And that kind of courage didn't belong to uniforms alone. She had seen it in farmers who sheltered strangers at the risk of their own lives, in children who carried water through dangerous streets for the wounded, in soldiers who stayed behind so others could escape. Courage was a quiet, stubborn thing, often unnoticed, often unpraised, but no less real. As she worked, she imagined a ripple this day might cause. Perhaps some young private in the hall would remember her story years from now, when faced with their own moment of choice. Perhaps one of the reporters would write an article, and someone far away would read it and see a reflection of their own unspoken past. The thought didn't fill her with pride so much as a sense of responsibility. If her voice had been heard once, maybe it should be used again, not for fame, but for truth. Her shift ended, but she didn't leave immediately. She sat for a while on a bench in a quiet corner of the hall, the mop and bucket beside her. The marble was cool against her palms, the air still carrying a faint hum from earlier. She let her thoughts settle like dust after a storm. She thought of the war, not just the pain, but the moments of unexpected grace. The soldier who gave her his last piece of chocolate before they went into a dangerous mission. The stranger who had guided her through a ruined neighborhood to safety. The captain, now a general, who had called out into the chaos and given her something to move toward. Those memories, she realized, were not weights to carry, but markers of a path she had walked. Proof that she had been there, that she had done what needed to be done. When she finally rose to leave, she passed the now empty podium. The light from the high windows caught the surface of the microphone, and for a heartbeat, she imagined herself standing there, speaking to a room full of strangers. Not about war in terms of politics or strategy, but about the people who lived through it. The quiet heroes who never wore medals, the ones who had no audience when they acted. She didn't know if she ever would, but the idea no longer felt impossible. Outside, the afternoon light had softened, spilling across the wide steps of the building in a warm golden wash. The city moved on as it always did, taxis honking, vendors calling, pedestrians hurrying with their own private burdens. Lena descended the steps slowly, each one grounding her back in the present. But as she walked, she carried with her the sense that the line between her past and her present had blurred. She was no longer just a woman with the mop, nor just a medic from another life. She was both, and she would always be both. Somewhere behind her, in the grand hall, The echoes of her story lingered, waiting to be remembered. And Lena knew this. Courage might not always wear uniform, but it never truly fades.